Hello and welcome to another episode of Ain't It Scary with Sean and Carrie, brought to you by Killer Podcasts and Evergreen Podcasts Network. I'm the titular Sean.
And I'm the very titular Carrie.
It's the show that takes you inside the unbelievable, the unexplainable, the macabre, and the bizarre and tries to find an answer. Hello, wife.
Hi.
Carrie, this week we're back in the world of true crime, but I'm taking us all the way back to Beijing 1937.
Okay.
Because this week's case is a stone-cold whodunit that comes to us from pre-World War II China. On January 8th, 1937, the horribly mutilated body of 19-year-old Pamela Werner was found within a few miles of her family's home in Beijing. And now, at the time, the police tried to investigate, but ultimately they ended up losing the thread amid the chaos of a city full to bursting with war refugees and besieged from the outside by foreign invaders. Now, despite several leads, the case was ultimately left unsolved and largely forgotten amid the larger chaos of World War II, which of course would kick off just after this, certainly especially in China. But several new leads have emerged within the past 20 years, or at least several new explanations for the case.
Interesting. I've never even heard of this.
Yet, basically no one had until a couple of books were written about it since the year 2000, since the year 2010, really. So let's talk about Beijing 1937, because it is not only a foreign country, but a foreign time. In 1937, Beijing was a fascinating, sad, very scary place, then still called Peking in Western languages. I was curious why that was, by the way. Apparently, a lot of the names given to Chinese cities were given to them, the Western names were originated with the French when there were French missionaries there like 400 years ago. Mm-hmm. And since then, the Mandarin pronunciations have changed. The language actually changed so that that J in Beijing used to be pronounced kind of like a hard C or a K. Mm-hmm. So the Chinese name back then for Beijing would have been Peking or something like that. And so, you know, the white people got it wrong, but not as wrong as you would assume when they they just continued calling it Peking because that's what white people called it until pretty recently. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Peking, as any Englishman there would have called it in 1937, was, as I said, a fascinating but scary place. I think it would make a great setting for a Coen Brothers style, like what's the point of all this crime drama, or some kind of a postmodern, poor taste Quentin Tarantino thing could be done here. There's a lot of interesting elements in this city. Beijing had been the capital until very recently, but in 1937 it was no longer the capital because Kuomintang, and by the way, pronunciations I will be. I'm out at sea here for a lot of this, so I'm going to do my best. But the leader of the Kuomintang, which is and was a nationalist Chinese party, kind of the main opposition to the communists throughout 20th century history. Mm-hmm. Their leader was Chiang Kai-shek at the time, and he had moved himself, the base of the government and the capital, therefore, to Nanjing after the Northern Expedition. That's where Kai-shek had joined together with the Chinese Communist Party to fight off warlords that were still holding a bunch of territory up north and reunify the country.
I remember that name from history class.
Yeah, Chiang Kai-shek's a very famous figure. And he had moved, the Northern Expedition was like 10 years ago at this point, and he and the communists, the Kuomintang and the communists, had been fighting each other ever since for control of China. So it was like, put our weapons down, we fight these warlords up north, and then we immediately assassinate and kill each other for the next 10 years. However, in 1937, the nationalists and communists had recently put aside their differences, laid down arms, and joined forces once again to fight a common enemy, in this case, the encroaching Japanese army. Although Kai-shek only agreed to this after some communists held him hostage for 2 weeks, so it was sort of a forced friendship.
Yeah.
But he was now nominally allied with Mao Zedong and the People's Liberation Army against the incoming Japanese. Mm-hmm. You see, the Japanese had sort of owned a big chunk of northern China, a region called Inner Manchuria, ever since they had invaded in 1931. And that invasion This seems to be kind of a pattern with Japanese military operations in the 30s. They invaded Manchuria because there were Japanese railroads already, Japanese companies operating private railroads. And the Japanese army was moving through there one day when they said the Chinese army or Chinese nationalists had blown up some dynamite near one of the railroad tracks. Wasn't even enough dynamite to like damage the railroad, really. But Japan used this as an excuse to launch a massive invasion of Manchuria and take the country for itself. By the way, the League of Nations would later investigate and call this whole thing bullshit. Like, it was a total false flag operation. Some Japanese army guys just blew up some dynamite near a train track and said, we have to invade now.
Yeah, I mean, false flags do happen. That's why they become conspiracies, because we know that they've happened before in all different kinds of places.
And as far as the historical record has it, it seems like this was just this one army, like this regional army, just acting on its own. And the government types back in Tokyo were actually surprised and bewildered that they were now invading Manchuria.
Yeah.
But they had no choice but to go through with it, and they had now turned Inner Manchuria into Manchukuo, which was a puppet state with the last previous emperor of China, who had been deposed, a guy named Puyo, was sitting as the figurehead of this little fake country. But even the League of Nations, which was still kind of getting its footing and never would get its footing, officially recommended not recognizing Manchukuo's legitimacy as a country, and certainly China did not recognize Manchukuo's legitimacy as a country.
Was the League of Nations like a precursor to the United Nations?
Yes, that was Woodrow Wilson's big dream for creating a world peace after World War I. It failed. Partly because Japan pulled out after this investigation of various countries pulled out of the League of Nations after the League returned decisions they didn't like.
Yeah.
And Japan was one of the first to go like, this isn't going to work for us anymore. Now, getting back to Beijing, every nation with legations, which was the time... At the time, that was the term for like delegates and ambassadors, your dignitaries. Everyone with dignitaries in Beijing were allowed to keep armed guards at specific points along the railway throughout China. Because you had to guard your diplomats, right? So these other countries are operating in the same area. You don't want them kidnapping your diplomats. So you have a couple of guys there, armed guards. Now, in 1937, Japan was in the process of beefing up its complement of guards along the railway. To the tune of, over a couple of months, they would go from like 7,000 troops in the country to 15,000 troops by July later this year, when the Imperial Japanese Army finally bullied Chinese nationalists into a fight at Wanping, which is just over 10 miles away from our story, so very close to here, and kicked off the Second Sino-Japanese War with the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident. Which was another thing where it seems like the Japanese army kind of invented a provocation and then like yelled about it until they got into a fight, sort of.
Okay.
So it's kind of an MO. Ultimately, the Second Sino-Japanese War was horrible. It was a brutal and bloody scrum, and it would eventually be swallowed up into the larger, brutal, bloody chaos of the Second World War. But when Pamela Werner died, the Marco Polo Bridge incident was still almost 6 months out, and it was only the threat of war that gripped Beijing in early 1937, because the nearest detachment of Japanese soldiers was camped within miles of the imperial city, which is the older, kind of inner part of the city. Now, despite being no longer the capital, Beijing was still one of the richest cities in China at this time. It is now. I think it's like 9th or 10th, but at the time it was the third richest city. The Japanese army, however, was beginning to choke some trade from the nearby rails, just kind of scaring away shipments with their so-called military exercises. And according to Paul French, who is the author of our main source, I would say main source for today, Midnight in Peking, a 2011 book that kind of revived interest in this case. French says the Japanese army were also secretly funding and supporting drug dealers to accelerate the worsening conditions and morale deterioration inside the city. Or at least Chinese officials believed that was happening.
Interesting.
Whether it was true or just rumors, people were aware very aware, is the point, of the Japanese troops that were camped nearby. Every second of every day, you just don't, you know why they're there, right? You just don't know when they're coming. And so most of the people...
Stressful.
Yeah. For everyone living in Beijing, this probably felt like the end of the world could be coming at any moment. The results of war elsewhere in the world was plain in the condition of residents' new neighbors, who were largely refugees from wars and atrocities across the continent. There were many Chinese refugees fleeing devastation from many... I mean, probably some still dehomed from the Northern Expedition and all the battles there, but now there had been sectarian violence with the communists for years, and there were refugees created by that violence. Mm-hmm. But there were also many white refugees in Beijing at the time, and most of them came from Russia. The communists had just taken over, and if you weren't happy living under communist rule, or if you didn't want to take on that system, they hadn't just taken... I know you're looking at me like that.
No, I was just wondering why you would leave Russia for China. It seems like similar ideologies, no?
Well, Mao Zedong hadn't taken over yet, so no.
Oh, I see. You know, I have to admit that probably this era of Asian history is definitely a blind spot of mine because I don't think we were taught very much about it in school.
For most Westerners, and I would say not just this part of history, but all of Asian history is kind of a mystery to us.
I mean, I definitely have to just read up on it more myself, but...
Yeah, we have to take that responsibility on ourselves. And that was part of what was fascinating reading this case, as I got to immerse myself in a place I was so unfamiliar with. Mm-hmm. But so many Russians fleeing the Soviet government, which had been set up at the end of World War I, and of course just, I guess, continuing violence in the aftermath of the Civil War and of the Russian Revolution. Mm-hmm. There were also some Jews, of course, and others fleeing Nazi Germany, which was starting to get scary at this time, or was starting to complete its descent into scariness.
How was China in terms of welcoming refugees, especially Jewish people? Like, was there any racism there, or
not near? It doesn't seem like there was nearly the kind of racism you would see in Europe against Jews at this time.
Interesting.
In Europe, it seems like Jews couldn't catch a break for I don't know, most of history.
Yeah.
But here, as long as you weren't a Russian refugee, I think the refugees were mostly living pretty well. It wasn't all refugees, by the way. There was your standard smattering for an international city of army deserters from different countries, criminal fugitives from different countries, world travelers who just hadn't, had put down roots for a little while there. But everyone except the Russians enjoyed the privileges of extradition. Mm-hmm. And not having to live under Chinese laws, but being treated as citizens of their home country.
Oh, I see.
But the people who had fled Russia were now stateless. They had refused to become citizens of the Soviet Union, and they weren't citizens of China, but they were subject to local laws, while not having any local advocacy.
Could they apply for citizenship, or was it very difficult?
I don't know what the process would have been like, but I didn't hear of a single white person applying for Chinese citizenship. Hmm. I'm sure it happens and happened.
Sure.
But, so the condition of these Russians, in 1935, the League of Nations did a survey in Shanghai where they found that 22% of the Russian women living there in 1935, between the ages of 16 to 45, were engaging in sex work to pay the bills. 22%. And Shanghai was much richer than Beijing was at this time. So presumably the economic opportunities were worse, and the percentage would have been even higher in Beijing.
It's a high percentage.
It's a high percentage. And a lot of the time that means out-and-out prostitution, but there was also something called taxi dancers at this time. In the 30s, dance halls were very popular, and guys would pay women to dance with them.
Oh.
And maybe, I don't know if that then transitions into the more traditional form of sex work, you know what I mean? If the date goes well, as it were. But yeah, taxi dancers. Taxi! You stand out on the edge of the floor, you just hail one. Now, on the other hand, most expatriates, to distinguish from refugees, Europeans who had chosen to live in Beijing often had stable foreign sources of income, foreign dollars that exchanged really favorably with Chinese dollars and let them live above their means. We'll talk about the Snows a little later. They were journalists. They owned a racehorse at this time, just on like newspaper writer money. So you could live pretty well in Beijing provided you were making American dollars somehow. Or British pounds.
Right, just something with a good transfer rate.
Exactly. Now, in 1937, Edward Theodore Chalmers Werner was not making an income, but he had already retired from his career, and he was settling in to do what had always made him tick, which was learning. Werner had had a fascinating life. He was born in New Zealand to a wealthy Prussian father, and apparently his dad took the family gallivanting around the world in his youth, so he got an appreciation for foreign cultures. He went back to England, again, born in New Zealand, but he went home to England to attend school, but then had to seek employment after his father died pretty young, when Edward was still in his teens. So he put in as a cadet with the Foreign Office and was sent to Peking, Beijing, to learn Chinese, the language, that is. I assume, they just keep saying Chinese, but I assume they mean Mandarin when they say it.
Well, they're different dialects, so I don't know. I don't know what they speak in Beijing, but
I think it probably depends on who you're speaking to.
yeah.
So he headed to Beijing to serve as a student interpreter and learn the language. It's funny to do both those things at the same time, but I guess you have to learn fast.
Sounds confusing.
It sounds horribly confusing, but Werner found that he really liked Beijing. He took to the language and culture of China, and the whole time he lived in this city, which would be almost until his death, basically, he became a fixture riding its streets alone on his bicycle. Apparently, though, he rubbed a lot of his superiors the wrong way.
While he was in the army or
diplomatic service.
diplomatic.
We'll see later that he could be a squeaky wheel, to say the least. And a lot of the time, Werner would end up with remote postings and shit ends of the stick just because he had made some superior mad. But he made a good living. He managed to marry a wealthy young woman from a good family, Gladys Ravenshaw.
So I'm presuming not a Chinese woman.
No, this is a European
by that very
woman, a British woman.
British name. Gladys Ravenshaw.
And the couple eventually chose to retire to Beijing in 1914 when Werner retired at 50 years old.
Okay, so in 1914, he's 50.
Yep, and 50 does sound young to retire. That's because this was a forced retirement.
Oh.
His superiors asked him to step aside after he had whacked a customs official with a whip.
I don't think you whack someone with a whip. I think you whip them.
He whipped him with it then. He assaulted a customs official with a whip during a disagreement.
Tough. That's tough.
In like the doing of his official duties, you know what I mean? It's like he was supposed to be diplomatic.
Yeah, not very diplomatic to whip someone.
Well, the couple settled into a quiet life, and in 1919 they adopted 2-year-old Pamela from some Portuguese nuns at the local church. Pamela was assumed, we don't know who her parents were, her birth parents, but she was assumed to be the daughter of some Russian exiles due to her fair complexion and gray eyes. And a lot of orphans, I think, were the products of Russian exiles because Russians were killing themselves at an alarming rate in this city.
Jesus. That's a big melting pot too. You get a Russian daughter to British parents from Portuguese nuns in China.
Yeah.
It's like New York.
Now, unfortunately, Pamela's mother, her adoptive mother, Gladys, would die under treatment for meningitis in 1922. Possibly of an overdose of whatever medication they were giving her. But the point is, Edward Werner dedicated himself fully to his adopted daughter after this. Aww. They spent all their time together when she was young. She was fluent by a young age in Chinese, And she shared her father's love for riding the city on her bike. And when she got older, into her teen years, she would do that alone, just like her father did.
Was that safe for her to do alone? I mean, I guess we know how this story ends, so probably not. But
it depends on what parts of the city you stick to. And we'll hear a little bit more about the neighborhoods around Pamela in just a bit. Now, in 1937, Edward and Pamela Werner were living in a converted, here's one of these pronunciations I don't have right, Sihuan. Might not be bad, actually.
That sounds pretty good.
It's a traditional, like, courtyard house. If you picture like, an old movie set in China and people live in this, like, ranch-style house, but in the middle there's a yard.
I think that's the kind of house that they have at the Peabody Essex Museum in
yes,
Salem.
that probably does have a courtyard.
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Although it might be multi-story.
And like an open top kind of thing. Like it's open in the middle.
Yeah, that's courtyard.
Thank you. But they also did that in Rome a lot, too.
Yeah, well, they didn't have air conditioning.
That's fair enough.
So their courtyard house was on a narrow alley just outside of the legation district. And you'll remember that legations meant diplomats and stuff. So this was the diplomatic district where all the ambassadors lived. It's also where many of the expats and white refugees would gather and live. They kind of all clustered around this neighborhood. Like, oh, I guess the white people go over here. And they all just sort of went. Now, 72 years old, Edward passed the time lecturing at Peking University, which he made a small income for, and furthering his study of Chinese dialects on long walks and rides around the city. Pretty active guy.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty good retirement.
Yeah. And in January, Pamela was home on holiday from Tientsin Grammar School.
So boarding school?
Yes. Now, in Midnight in Peking, Paul French tells us headmaster Sidney Yates may have made sexual overtures to Pamela.
Yeah.
And this guy had then been forced to leave his post and was at this time preparing to return to England. Anyway, Werner was of a mind at the time when this all happened. Werner was of a mind to send her back to England to finish school. Like, no daughter of mine! But Pamela was not cool with that. She loved Beijing and she wanted to stay with her father and her friends at school.
She shouldn't be punished for some creep hitting on her.
That's true, but she was worried. She did stay in Beijing, but that's when she started going to Tientsin School, which was in another city. I mean, it was a hike for her, and she had to be away from home. It was a boarding school. Werner sounds like a pretty protective dad.
Yeah.
And he was also nervous. Maybe this was part of the motivation for trying to send her back to England. He was also nervous about all of the attention his pretty young daughter was getting from young men. In fact, in 1931, at the beginning of this decade, he had broken a young Chinese man's nose with his cane outside of their house while he was accusing him of having sex with Pamela.
And how old was she at this point?
31 or 32, so she would have been like 13 or 14.
I mean, I can't blame him. If you really thought that was happening, she's very young at that point.
Yeah. And it was after that incident. It was after the incident where he broke this young man's nose. That young student's name was Han Shuqing. And after poor Han's nose was broken, Werner pulled her out of the school. That's when he pulled her out of the school she was in and sent her to Tientsin.
Well, I have to say, my dad was very protective, but he never broke anyone's nose. So I guess point in his favor.
Yeah, I never feared that.
Well, I had already moved out by the time I met you, so I don't think there was any...
Oh, I just mean I assumed he would act with more finality than a punch in the face with a cane.
That's just because he's Italian. Now you're stereotyping.
On January 7th, 1937, Pamela went to the dentist in the morning for an appointment, came home to catch up on some letter writing. Catch up with friends from back at school while you're home on break, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. A family servant, Ho Ying, went to the market at 3 p.m. And like I said, if you had a little bit of American or British money, you could live very well, right? So they had it sounds like several servants. There was like a gatekeeper and stuff. Mm-hmm. But Ho sounds like he was kind of the butler. I mean, he was his man Friday kind of
Yeah, running
situation.
the house kind of guy.
So
Carson and Downton Abbey.
yes. So at 3 p.m., Ho was going to the market, which he did every day, and he asked if Pamela wanted anything. And Pam said no. She was leaving soon for the house, so she wouldn't be back when he got home with the sweetmeats or whatever it was he was offering her. But she did ask him to prepare meatballs and rice for dinner and said she'd be home by 7:30. Meatballs and rice. That's kind of that's what a European living in China eats, right?
Yeah, sure.
Just
it's close to Chinese food, but not quite.
You guys don't do spaghetti here, huh?
All right, we'll have very short spaghettis.
Now, the gatekeeper told Ho later that he had seen Pamela leave the house on her bike shortly after Ho did. Pamela made plans to meet her friend Ethel Gurevich, who was a daughter of Russian emigres, at the Wagons Litz Hotel the previous day. And so after meeting up at the hotel as planned, they went to Ethel's house, and Ethel's mother said she served the girls tea and cakes. But Pam said she wasn't hungry. She had also told Ethel, when they met at the hotel, she mentioned to Ethel that she had been at the Wagons Litz Hotel earlier that day. But we're not sure. We're not sure exactly why. We'll get a little more detail on that later. But yeah, she mentioned...
Well, she could have been psyched for the meatballs and just trying to keep some space in there.
Well, yeah, but why did she go to the hotel earlier?
Oh, that I don't know.
Right. So around 6 p.m., Ethel and Pamela hit the skating rink with a third friend named Lilian Marinovsky, another Russian. At one point, Pamela walked away from the other two to talk to some other girl she knew at the rink, and they didn't hear what was said. But mostly the three were together the whole time. And at 7:30, Pamela said that she had to go home for dinner. Her friends say they asked if she was sure she was okay alone. It was after dark, and she was leaving on her bike. To which Pamela said, "I always ride by myself, and nothing can happen to me here in Peking."
Well, nothing had happened yet, Pamela.
She rode away with her ice skates over her shoulder. This was the last time anyone would ever see Pamela Werner alive.
How old is she at this point?
19 years old.
19.
I'll show you these two pictures that were taken in the same photo shoot within a week of her death.
Oh, very pretty. It's like everyone back then. She looks like she's 30 years old.
Yes, even though she's 19. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. She looks so much like my grandmother. You know? It was 8 p.m. when ETC. By the way, I wonder if he ever went by etc.
That's his rap name.
Etc. Warner. When ETC got home at 8 o'clock, he was surprised to find Pamela wasn't home. He thought she was supposed to be home for dinner. They waited around until 10:30 before he asked Ho Ying to go out looking. By the time the servant got to the ice rink, the workers were closing up. He asked about whether they'd seen a girl of Pamela's description, but they said there were like 200 skaters there that night, and there was no way they could pick out one individual girl. Mm-hmm. So Ho returned to the Werner residence, and ETC dismissed him for the night, and then went out searching himself with a torch, he says, until 1 a.m. And by torch, he means flashlight, because he's British.
This isn't Frankenstein.
Yes, that's right. But he could only do it till 1. I mean, he's 72 years old. I'm impressed that he did as much as he did. Mm-hmm. On January 8th, at 8 a.m., 2 rickshaw drivers were pulling their carts along the outer walls, along the old walls of the city, when they saw a few stray dogs sniffing with interest at a bundle near the foot of the wall, along with an elderly man. So, I mean, the streets are pretty crowded, right? Then and now in any Chinese city, I think. So they were just like, "Hey, you, come here." An elderly man came over, and the 2 drivers and the old man approached the bundle to find the body of what appeared to be a young European woman, severely cut and beaten.
Why'd they ask the old guy to come over with them?
He might have just been a looky-loo.
Oh, okay. All right, so...
The old man ran to the nearest police box to call the authorities, while the drivers secured the scene and covered the body with a bamboo mat to try to discourage onlookers. Colonel Han Shi-chung of the Peking police was the supervisor on the investigation. His first thought upon arriving on scene was that this was yet another Russian white emigre ending it all in the face of hopelessness. This was, by the way, the day after Russian Orthodox Christmas, which fit that theory nicely.
But would they often just do it in public?
I'll tell you one thing. Most people don't commit suicide with wounds as severe as the ones that Pamela had, which was something the policeman became aware of as soon as he lifted the bamboo mat. Now it looked like there was a young European woman who had been murdered in his jurisdiction, and so he thought it was best to call the Legation Police Commissioner, W.P. Thomas, to the scene as well. So the guy in charge of the white police.
Mm-hmm.
Pamela's skull had been fractured with several blows from a heavy, possibly smooth piece of wood or stone. And the autopsy labeled these wounds as the cause of her death. They were delivered with intense force from very close to Pamela, which led some of the investigators to suspect maybe this was someone she knew because they got up close to her, right? Mm-hmm. And attacked her with a viciousness that says maybe not random. These things are always big maybes, though.
Right.
There was blunt force trauma to the girl's right arm, but little hemorrhaging there. Like the bones were cracked, but not much bruising, so that blow was likely post-mortem.
Mm-hmm.
And there were also several, I'm going to say several, I'm not going to say many, but I haven't seen an exact number. She was multiply stabbed and slashed in her trunk and belly.
Interesting. So multiple weapons used.
No, I think just one knife, but stabs.
No, I mean the blunt force trauma.
Yes.
And the knife.
Yes, she was most likely hit with something, yes, and then a knife was used to cut her up.
It's unusual.
And there was little bleeding in the stab and slash wounds.
So probably also post-mortem.
Also post-mortem. Now here's where we get to the stuff that will really make you pause and really make you think. Several internal organs had been removed through 2 large slits in Pamela's belly, and most of the blood was drained from her body. Her stomach was left behind, but I think her liver was taken, and her ribs had been cracked from the inside to make room to pull her heart out through the wound.
Jesus.
These wounds certainly couldn't have come from the dogs that were sniffing at the package, and investigators noted the surgical or medical precision it would have taken to do this quickly and deliberately, as the killer obviously had.
Jack the Ripper styles.
That's yes. So that's what this calls immediately to mind, because that's the same thing they say about those crimes where women were ripped.
Yes.
As I said, Pamela's stomach was still present, and that was full of half-digested Chinese food.
And she hadn't eaten at tea.
She only ate a cookie or something at tea.
So she had gotten something to eat midway between?
That's what investigators kind of suspected, and between that and the look of her wounds, they placed the time of death sometime between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Werner's skirt had been loosened, her silk stockings were torn, and her underwear was missing. But she was wearing her overcoat and her shoes. And one early working police theory was that this was evidence of moving and staging of the crime scene. I guess because if you were going to sexually assault someone, they're probably naked, and then she's been clothed again.
Well, was there evidence of sexual assault, like injury or anything like that?
Impossible to tell if traditional sexual assault had taken place because Pamela's vagina had been repeatedly penetrated with a knife. So
I hope that's post-mortem.
So any evidence that would have been there from pre- or post-mortem sexual assault was just destroyed.
Okay.
Colonel Hahn's working theory was that someone sexually obsessed with Pamela had killed her, attempted to dismember the body, and then ran out of time or just gave up and dumped it there. Nobody knew who this corpse actually was, though, until E.T.C. Werner stumbled upon the scene.
Oh, no.
He had woken up, left a note with Commissioner Thomas, the guy who was on his way from Legation Police. Werner had gone to his office and left a note about his daughter being missing, and then immediately just headed into the neighborhoods to continue his own search on foot.
It's sad.
As soon as he saw Pamela, he recognized her clothing and jewelry, shrieked, "Pamela!" and collapsed in tears next to the body. I think one of the cops was able to confirm her identity, and she was autopsied by the evening.
Oh, that's very sad.
And so went the death of Pamela Werner. The investigation wouldn't have the time, the scope, the resources, or probably the evidence to come to a satisfying conclusion. But investigate they would, and we will get into what investigators did and what Mr. Werner did after the break.
All right.
Something is creeping in, don't follow it down.
24 hours ago, I found out the person that I've been dating for the last 6 months is a con man.
That is my sister Emma. Andrew Tonks's lies had been so convincing, she'd invested $300,000 with him. However, the tables were about to turn on Andrew. What he didn't know was that Emma had discovered his real identity. But to get any chance of justice, Emma had to act like it was business as usual. Coming up in this series,
and that's when murder, all this stuff goes through my mind. I'm really, really scared.
I'm assuming Sarah has watched too much Netflix and figures I've been defrauding you. Couldn't be further from the truth.
That's what this was, a real life story that seems so unbelievable, but it was actually true.
a true story that all starts with one simple swipe to the right. I'm Sarah Ferris.
And I'm Emma Ferris, and this is my story, Conning the Con.
Welcome back. In our first segment, we gave you the facts of the case, the discovery of the body of poor 19-year-old Pamela Werner in Beijing, 1937. Actually, I guess we spent most of that segment just setting the scene of Beijing, 1937.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting place.
Well, it seems like another character in the story.
Ah, like Manhattan.
Sure.
In Manhattan. So it was time for police to start investigating. It did look like a murder had taken place here.
Yeah, I would say so.
Because people don't usually commit suicide by cutting themselves across the belly and then tearing out their own heart.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement.
And she appeared to have died from a blow to the head and then been mutilated afterward.
Mm-hmm.
None of it's consistent with a suicide, right? So now you have a young European woman who's been murdered in Beijing, and the authorities are looking for who did it. But it was tough to investigate deaths because there was a lot of death in Beijing at this time. Mm-hmm. Bodies were routinely collected from the streets at a rate of like several per morning at this time in Beijing.
For what reason? Murder?
Most of them were suicides or disease.
Jeez.
You're going to get some overdoses too. You can lump those in with the suicides, but there were a lot of like opium addicts who and other drug addicts of various kinds. And again, we had the idea the Japanese army was like funneling drugs into the city, or whether that was true or not. It was a problem. So that was another source of deaths. Murders also happened, certainly, resulting from petty crime, as murders do, but also possibly provocations from the Japanese army, political murder by Kuomintang officials. The local nationalist army officers had been ordering just summary executions when they found drug dealers, partially because they were supposedly working with the Japanese. So a lot of people were dying.
Now, was she treated any differently because of her background?
Well, the investigation went differently because Beijing police worked closely from the beginning with the legation police, with Thomas's office, because while the killing had happened in Chinese jurisdiction, and therefore they didn't need to work with the legation police necessarily, they were going to have to interview a lot of Europeans. Mm-hmm. And they figured that Thomas's office would just have friendlier relationships with foreign nationals and be able to get a little further with European whites. International cooperation of this kind was really rare. I mean, when we talk about serial killers 40 years after this, law enforcement agencies in the U.S. couldn't seem to agree.
Yeah, county by county.
Yeah, enough to work together to catch a guy. So the idea of these two departments that a lot of the officers probably don't speak the same languages.
There might be racial tension mixed in there.
Yeah, but everyone involved seems to have been attacking the issue of investigating this murder from a place of good faith.
Well, at least there's that.
So cooperating with investigators, now from Scotland Yard was called in. Colonel Hahn got a ton of reports. A ton of people had heard about this, obviously, and a ton of people, as you always get, were interested in solving it. Most of these reports were determined to be false, though. In one case, early on, neighbors in the area were reporting seeing a rickshaw driver near the Fox Tower, which was the wall tower where Pamela's body had been found. And this man was apparently washing a bloody seat cushion the morning after the murder.
Okay, that's suspicious.
Police picked the guy up, they looked into his story, and it turned out, according to the rickshaw driver, a Russian expatriate and an American Marine had gotten into a fight in his cab the night before, someone had gotten stabbed, and there you go, just trying to clean up the bloodstain. And I guess the police were like, yep, that's Beijing. Because they didn't talk to this guy again.
Okay.
But they did question the obvious witnesses, ETC Werner and also Pamela's friends, who each corroborated each other's timeline of events. Retracing the girls' steps, investigators heard from the concierge at the Wagenslitz Hotel that Pamela had come by earlier that day, between 3 and 4. She inquired about renting a room and checked out a brochure.
Is it possible she was doing sex work on the side?
It is. Well, everything's possible, right? But that particular solution seems unlikely to me because her family was well off.
Yeah.
She might have had friends who were involved in sex work because it seems like a lot of her friends were Russian girls who probably had poor families.
Yeah, I was just thinking about why she would be renting a room and be very cagey about it.
It's never satisfactorily explained, but my two kind of pet theories are maybe she wanted a little freedom from her overbearing dad and she wanted a room to stay in when she was in Beijing. Mm-hmm. Or maybe she wanted a boyfriend to come visit from school while she was home.
And didn't want his nose to get broken.
So, those are two things that come to my mind. But for some reason, Pamela was at the hotel earlier that day. In any case, by his first press conference on January 10th, Colonel Hahn had no answers for reporters or for the public. And so the public filled in the gaps with speculation, right? That's what they do. Mm-hmm. So the Fox Tower, which again was near where Pamela had been found, was long considered haunted. So more superstitious residents were like, ooh, vengeful spirits, had maybe torn the girl apart for some imagined offense or because she wandered into some curse, Mm-hmm. Now some, especially those familiar with Werner's short fuse and his bad personal skills, suggested he had killed his own daughter in a fit of temper. Scotland Yard never seems to have seriously considered this as a possibility. I mean, they saw how broken up he was when he first saw her.
Was there ever any evidence of him abusing her?
No.
Yeah, I don't know.
Even people who would like you to consider that as a possibility for this crime
have to admit that there's no evidence.
Will not tell you that he beat his daughter because I don't think there's any evidence for it.
Okay.
Now, I mentioned the Snows before. They're journalist neighbors. Mm-hmm. So Helen Foster Snow, the wife in that couple, raised her theory to police. She thought that it was possible the Kuomintang could have assassinated Pamela, mistaking her for Helen.
Oh. Did they look alike?
Very similar. And in fact, the police noted how, she said this, and they were like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, lady. But then they saw a picture of Pamela and next to Helen were like, oh, they look remarkably alike.
Interesting.
Helen and her husband Edgar Snow were liberal American journalists who had been busily painting a sympathetic portrait of Chinese communists, especially in contrast to the nationalist Kuomintang, who they kind of portrayed as barbarous fascists. Scotland Yard actually considered this one briefly as a possibility for the murder. However, and there were nationalist groups around, both unofficial and official at this time, who could have done a murder like that or taken it upon themselves to do so. But the fascist private organization, the Blue Shirt Society, and the more official, quote, Military Statistics Bureau, who both did kill Chinese citizens and foreign nationals, usually did their killings cleaner, just a bullet to the head and dropped in a ditch. If this is a political murder, why do you go to all the work of ripping her heart out?
To make it look like it wasn't a political murder?
Usually you want political murders to look like what they are, so they inspire fear. Mm-hmm. But maybe, right?
Well, this seems like there's a sexual bent to it, just like Jack the Ripper.
Yes, I agree. And the police kind of agreed with you, too, and they didn't even know what a serial killer was yet. Meanwhile, police started canvassing the nearby Badlands district. It was a shady neighborhood right next to the Legation district that was full of bars and brothels. And
the Badlands were shady? I don't believe it.
Once police were showing interest in the Badlands, a local Russian landlady revealed that she had found a bloody rag and a dagger in the possession of one of her tenants. This man, she said, was a British expatriate named Pinfold.
First or last name?
Well, all the local papers called him was Pinfold. Because I don't know that police ever told the papers his full name. And so in the papers, he was just Pinfold. Mm-hmm. Police reported on searching Pinfold's house. They found blood-stained shoes, a dagger, a sheath, and a handkerchief. All of those also covered in blood. Mm-hmm. Now, the author of Death in Peking, the second book in the last 20 years that's come out about this crime, author Graham Shepard says he tracked down a Fred Pinfold living in Beijing in 1937 by checking Beijing's consular registers from the 30s. So every request that was put in with a consul at the time, a foreign dignitary or whatever, and somebody, we don't even know why or who, but somebody put in a request looking for Fred Pinfold at one time.
Well, I can't imagine there were a ton of Pinfolds around.
And from this, Shepard was able to extrapolate out who this guy was. Apparently, Pinfold's father died when he was very young. Fred ended up living with an aunt in modest conditions. He worked as an electrical engineer until he moved to China in the early 1900s. Then he worked in the Shanghai Volunteer Corps before returning to England to join the Canadian Army. Go figure that one. I don't know if he didn't get into the English Army.
It's a very roundabout way to do things.
But he did join the Canadian Expeditionary Force in England.
Okay.
At the time, he was described as 5'7". This is in his enlistment report, right? 5'7", 149 pounds, with hazel eyes and gray hair, 43 years old. He rose to Lance Corporal before the end of World War I, and then disappeared from any records at all, as far as Shepard could find, until January 1937, when he became a suspect in this investigation.
Did he know the family? Did he know ETC? Both being Brits?
No, not at all, but he would become acquainted with him.
All right.
Held overnight, Pinfold smoked heavily and fidgeted a lot, but said almost nothing. Police apparently suspected he was an opium addict, which again was very common in Beijing at the time. Mm-hmm. Apparently one officer, we shouldn't put too much weight on this, and I think one of the criticisms of Midnight in Peking is that it too often puts maybe a little too much weight on things like this. But apparently one officer claimed he recognized Pinfold as a man who had lingered a little bit longer than other passersby at the crime scene.
Okay.
Like, you're going to get looky-loos, right? But they noticed one guy was kind of looking for too long, and it was weird.
I mean...
And when this guy Pinfold came into the police station, he was like, wait, it was you!
Okay, well, that's really up to your own determination.
Yeah.
I mean, how long is too long to look at a corpse?
40 seconds, too long.
Yeah.
100%.
35, fine.
Police did find a business card in Pinfold's pocket for a bar at the address 27 Huanban Hutong. Hutong is an alley, so Huanbang is the name of the street. I'm getting that wrong, too.
I think you're doing a great job.
When they asked Canadian officials, apparently they got word that Pinfold was a known face at 28 Huanban next door.
Okay. Was that another bar?
I think it was like some kind of a business, because the 27 is referred to repeatedly as a bar. 28 is only ever referred to as 28. But we do have a guy who worked there. Maybe it was he's described as a barman, maybe. Yeah, okay. I think maybe they are bars right next to each other. But 27 was a bar that doubled as a brothel late at night.
Ah.
There were a lot of these, as we mentioned, in the Badlands. 28, store, brothel, whatever business it was, or store, bar, whatever business it was. I don't think that one also included a brothel. Pamela's friends told police that she usually consciously avoided walking through the Badlands for any reason.
Yeah, that sounds smart.
But as they were walking through the neighborhood, police noticed that night, if she happened to be in a rush, her most direct route home from the ice rink would have taken her right past 27 and 28 Huanban.
Hey, was her bike found with her or anywhere else?
No, I don't think her bike ever was found.
That's weird.
Yeah, but you can get rid of a bike.
Sure, but I mean, that means something.
Yeah, but I don't think bikes are as recognizable as cars.
No, that's not really my point. My point is what happened to the bike?
Sure.
Why wasn't she on the bike? Why couldn't she pedal away? You know?
Right. Well, she also ate food at some point.
Right.
Officers raided 28 Huanban while Han and Richard Dennis, his opposite number over at Scotland Yard, discreetly visited 27 Huanban themselves. French tells us, French is the author of Midnight in Peking, nothing came of the raid on the bar, and patrons who were there, who were shown Pamela's picture, didn't recognize her as having been there, but they did say it was crowded on January 7th, just like the ice rink was. At number 27, manager, possible barkeep, I think it was a bar, manager and barkeep and former U.S. Marine Joseph Knopf said he knew Pinfold. Yeah, I know that guy. He told police that Pinfold worked security next door at 28 Huanban. But Knopf also said, if we can take Mr. French at his word, at his printed word, Knopf also told police that Pinfold had been present at, quote, nudist weekends.
What?
At an exclusive club set in a cottage in Beijing's Western Hills. You know, just a big naked party.
Was it like an orgy or was it like just nudists?
No, just nudism. I think they would like go swimming, they would go hunting, like do some outdoor activities, but naked. They would dance and, you know, I mean, I'm sure there was probably sex involved, but I don't think it was fully just an orgy all weekend. Swimming and hunting were specifically mentioned.
I would not want to go hunting naked.
Well, the guys were actually having trouble going hunting. They had to close off the hunting, and then at some point they had to close off these nudist parties because the Japanese were getting too close to the city, apparently. And, you know, you don't want to be out there nude hunting deer.
Caught with your pants down?
Exactly. Caught with your pants off. The police now had something they could confront Pinfold with. And when they did, he confirmed he had, in fact, been there at some of these nudist weekends. But Pinfold said he only attended as a security guard. And he would sometimes also help recruit girls to come and dance naked for the other guests. He added that he didn't know Pamela. But he also wouldn't tell police where the blood on his knife came from.
All right. You gotta tell, Pinfold.
You do.
Make something up.
Yeah, there's an air of, I don't know, there's something tricky about this whole section of the story.
Yeah, it's weird.
Police eventually got out of Pinfold, apparently, that these weekends had been organized by an American dentist in Beijing named Wentworth Prentice.
Prentice the dentist?
Prentice the dentist.
Stop.
And Prentice the dentist mostly catered to wealthy expats and diplomats.
It's like when Michael Scott says his dentist's name is Prentice.
But his dentist's name is Prentice.
It's stupid.
Prentice the dentist came to Prentice the dentist came to China with his wife and kids in 1918, but then she and the kids left in 1932. So I don't know what happened with the marriage.
Well, it's not good, Sean.
But he was, that apparently freed him up to go to all these host all these nude parties. French has Richard Dennis and legation police going to interview Prentice at his flat and finding that the flat is right next to the ice rink that Pamela had been at the night before she disappeared.
Interesting.
When he heard of the police's interest in Prentice, Irish reporter George Gorman the next day took to the papers to mock police for even considering such a respectable man a suspect. Apparently, when Richard Dennis from the Scotland Yard looked into it, it did turn out Gorman had also participated in a few of these weekends.
Ah, there's the rub.
And there lies the rub. Ultimately, though,
Probably a few rubs.
despite newspaper reports to the contrary, initially, the blood on Pinfold's knife was apparently from an animal.
And they were able to tell this?
And once they were, he had to be released. Police had also...
So why didn't he just say it?
Wait, it's from an animal! Pinfold police found also had a second residence in the legation quarter. And since he technically was a resident of the legation quarter, he couldn't be charged with a crime without British authorities also charging him with a crime. And when the Chinese police talked to the British police, they all decided together there wasn't really anywhere near enough evidence to convict this guy, so there was no point.
He had 2 homes in the same city?
Yeah, he was very poor, though.
Okay.
We're told he only had, his pension and then a little bit of opium dealing money, basically.
All right.
Pinfold is believed to have left Beijing shortly after he was released from jail, and then he disappears from our narrative and from the historical record, as far as I can tell, altogether.
Weird.
Yeah. Now, throughout all of this, E.T.C. Werner was pestering police publicly and privately about the case. Local British authorities had offered a £10,000 reward for any information leading to Pamela or the killers. To which Werner complained that the reward should be available anonymously to encourage other people. He was like, Chinese people don't trust their government very much, and they certainly don't trust our government, so no one's going to reach out for this reward because it had to be deposited into a bank account. At the end of January, after Pinfold had been released, Werner held a public press conference demanding information from the police on why Pinfold was let go.
He's a squeaky wheel.
He also, at this point, added 5,000 Chinese gold dollars to the reward personally. This apparently more than doubled the reward, and at this point, the reward for information leading to Pamela was about triple the average income for a Chinese family for the year. Werner proclaimed the killers, in his opinion, were Western. He said in this press conference that he knew all about the Chinese, and they had no folk beliefs that involved harvesting organs.
Do Westerners?
That's what I said. It's like, yeah, do Westerners, do white people have those?
I don't think so. I think that's just a weird psychological thing.
Yeah, I don't think this is a cultural belief thing. As a direct result of this press conference, Richard Dennis with Scotland Yard and Colonel Han with Beijing police were both directly ordered not to talk to Werner anymore. And in particular, Werner had directly contradicted what authorities were investigating on at this point because their current feeling was the best bet was a young, sexually frustrated Chinese man. It's all swirling down the bottom of the drain, Carrie, and you might not be able to feel it yet, but it'll all move very quickly here.
Okay.
On January 30th, the details of the autopsy hit the papers for the first time. This immediately increased the fear and rumor among the populace. It increased the amount of reports people were making, and certainly, in the minds of the investigators, it made it much harder to eliminate suspects because now everyone knows everything about the case.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Richard Dennis, who was having health problems, was ordered to return to his office in Tientsin by the Chinese New Year, which was 2/7. When nothing new turned up by the 7th of February, Richard Dennis had to leave, leaving Han and his people alone in the investigation. Meanwhile, they had to get to other cases.
I'm sure they had less resources than Scotland Yard.
They sure did. And Chinese New Year was celebrated raucously in Beijing that year. One of the biggest parties most of these people had ever seen, because many suspected this might be the last one they would ever get to celebrate. Tanks were now being driven right through the city on a regular basis, Japanese tanks. And Zero fighters, that was the Japanese fighter jet of the time, Zero fighters would fly low overhead and buzz the town regularly. The Japanese were calling these routine maneuvers, but they were almost exclusively and almost certainly provocations to try to get the Chinese military to fire an accidental or stray shot and get them into a war.
Stressful.
The British consul in Beijing was Nicholas Fitzmaurice, and he officially closed the investigation at the end of June. At this point, it had been months since any more updates about the story had been in the papers, and so even the press conference announcing the investigation was at a close was sparsely attended. His conclusion, as best he could do, was Pamela was murdered by person or persons unknown, possibly Chinese.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I could have said that.
About anyone.
Literally.
Then, Fitzmaurice got on a boat and went home for his long summer vacation that he did every year, did a couple weeks of vacation. And within a couple weeks, on July 7th, the Marco Polo Bridge incident kicked off the Second Sino-Japanese War, and after that, Fitzmaurice never came back to the country at all. However, as the Japanese army moved in to occupy the city, E.T.C. Werner stayed in his little Sihuan.
Yeah, I didn't see him leaving.
Foreign governments, England and all the other ones, were urging all of their citizens to move into the legation quarter at this point, where they could protect them from the Japanese army. Like, listen, we told you guys to probably get out, but if you haven't gotten out by now, legation quarter, please. Werner refused, of course. He stayed in his little courtyard house, and while he couldn't do much of his former research under the occupation, he instead spent his time and money trying to convince the Foreign Office to reopen the case into his daughter's death, and, of course, continuing to investigate on his own. But Edward's prickly nature and the bad relationships he had with basically everyone immediately left basically everyone at the Foreign Office thinking he was just looking for another excuse to attack them publicly and personally.
He just wants to find who murdered his daughter. That's what he wants.
Eventually, because he did so much like coming up and knocking on their door and calling, instead of probably not calling, there weren't phones. There weren't phones widely available in Beijing. Eventually, he badgered the Foreign Service so much, they just banned him from the legation quarter.
Okay, or you could do your job, but okay.
They were trying to get him to live there, and then they were like, you know what? Don't even come here anymore. So he was collecting evidence on his own. And he would continually put this in letters to members of the Foreign Service and the British consulate, just like, look, I'm uncovering more details. You guys got to join me on this. Get in on this. He found that the brothel/bar at 28 Huanban had closed right after the murder.
Closed, like, permanently?
Yeah, and the owners left town for Nanjing or Shanghai, or he couldn't really be sure. That's a theme. he couldn't be sure, but he thinks. Here's another one. This is a bombshell. That rickshaw driver I told you about before with the bloody seat cushion. Werner said that guy told him it was actually stained when he picked up two men and a young European woman wrapped in a sheet who seemed to need help moving.
Why did he lie about it?
The driver said it was her blood on the seat and that Colonel Han, had lied about what he had told him.
Oh.
Now, Werner actually marched up to the British consul with this rickshaw driver. You know, he's not allowed in the legation quarter, but he doesn't care. He's
He
marching
doesn't
this
give a
rickshaw driver through the street. The consulate found the driver uncredible as a witness. Now, Prentice, the dentist,
Stupid.
one of the things he had told police, apparently in their interview, was that he had never treated Pamela Werner. Didn't know her, had never met her, never treated her. Werner produced a receipt from Prentice for straightening a few of Pamela's rear teeth, apparently just over a month before the murder. So he had, in fact, done work on her mouth.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Werner had been pestering police this whole time to get his daughter's clothes and effects back. They still had them. And when they finally do, the clothes hadn't been well maintained, the police had never fingerprinted them, and they hadn't been kept in bags or anything. It was pointless to try to fingerprint them now. But Werner did read his daughter's diary and found that last summer, Pamela claimed, she had gone to Western Hills for a weekend. That's where the nudist weekends supposedly were, with Gorman and his family. Gorman, the Irish reporter. And on this occasion, Gorman made sexual advances toward her.
Was it a nudist weekend?
No, I don't think so. Not in the diary. It's not described that way. And she doesn't mention going to a, fancy cottage or anything.
Just so many twists. Okay.
So many twists and turns. It is worth noting, we do know Pamela knew Gorman and his wife. The day before she was murdered, she had stopped by their house for tea. Not her dad, just her. So Werner's theory. Well, do you know what Werner's theory is at this point?
No, I have no idea.
So Werner thinks that Prentice the dentist...
Do you think he was ever a dentist's apprentice?
Prentice the dentist's apprentice.
Yeah.
He was a missionary. I think he came over as a Methodist missionary. Which I don't know how well that jives with the nudist weekends, but sometimes they surprise you. Werner's theory was that Prentice the dentist, Knopf the marine, possibly Gorman, the newspaper man, and the rest of the nude weekends gang lured Pamela into a Christmas party, quote unquote, at 28 Huanban Hutong in order to have sex with her. He reasons that Pamela would have refused, and in the midst of a struggle could have been hit in the head. Now, one day, a couple years after the murder, Werner was walking down, what's the street called? Huanban Hutong, and he saw that the door to 28 was just open. Mind you, it wasn't the same bar anymore. They had closed down.
So it's an abandoned building at this point.
But the door was just wide open, so he walked in. And he says when he went there, he noticed there was one wooden chair that had a broken leg that had to be replaced with a metal, strut. So he was like, I bet it was that chair!
I mean, it's a bar.
It's a stretch.
I'm sure they break chairs a lot.
It's a stretch, Werner. After Pamela's death, after Pamela's presumably accidental death, the killers would have transported her to the Fox Tower and mutilated her body with a hunting knife.
Now,
I don't know if that part's for the sick thrill of it.
Yeah, to what end? Just to cover up the motive for killing her, or the accidental nature of the murder?
With the way Werner writes about these guys, he thinks he's utterly taken aback at the idea of... It seems like the word nudity really makes him blush.
Well, especially in relation to his daughter.
Right, but I mean, when he's talking about this dentist going off into the woods and playing nude with his friends, he thinks these people are real. He keeps calling them sexualists.
Okay.
So he thinks they're really perverse people, and I think in his mind it's just like a little hop, skip, and a jump from nudist weekend to of course you like cutting open a nude young girl. They're sick, obviously. He was still investigating, still dedicating all of his time to this. In December of 1941, when after Pearl Harbor was attacked and the U.S. got into the war, Werner finally was forced to move into the legation district with the rest of the Americans. In 1943, the Japanese army finally moved all remaining residents of the legation quarter, including both Werner and his now archenemy Prentice the dentist,
Awkward.
into a Japanese internment camp in Shandong for the rest of the war. While living in the camp, Werner could apparently often be heard berating and confronting Prentice about the murder of his daughter. Although some fellow camp interns say that Prentice was not the only one that Werner accused.
What a weird situation.
And they lived in the next building to each other. They were neighbors. It was like Block 23, Block 24, something like that. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, Richard Dennis from Scotland Yard had become the police chief in Tientsin until the Japanese removed him and imprisoned him for months of solitary confinement and torture. He would later get out somehow with the help of the Swiss consulate, and then he worked a British Army desk job for a while. And finally, after the war, returned to Japan to participate in the war crimes trials of some of his former Japanese captors. Mm-hmm. Which has got to feel kind of good.
Yeah.
In 1945, with the war over, E.T.C. Werner returned to Peking. He immediately resumed pestering British officials about his daughter's case. In 1951, though, he returned home to England to spend his last few years, and in 1954, he died there. Pamela's murder was mentioned in passing in his obituary, and that was the last time in the 20th century any prominently published source would mention the crime anywhere.
Well, he was the one really keeping the fires burning in terms of that.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's not even like... There were waves of true crime interest, you know what I mean? But this never got kicked up again until 2011, when Paul French published Midnight in Peking. Apparently, he had uncovered some documents when he was looking through China's National Archives, including a 150-page letter from E.T.C. Werner to investigators. And so French found Werner's implication of Prentice and co. to be the likeliest explanation for the murder, and he spends his book... selling you that version of events.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel about it?
Well, French has come under a lot of criticism. And I have criticism of both of the books that have been written on this topic, both the books that I read for this topic. Let's talk about what people say about French first. Some have said that the sourcing in this Midnight in Peking book is... too reliant on Werner's letters and Werner's investigation and what Werner says he saw.
Doesn't seem to be like there's a lot of primary documents or evidence other than that.
There aren't, but I guess the problem with Werner is people have argued that he's an unreliable narrator in this case because he's so close to the case, because he's a possible suspect in the case, being the girl's dad, and because nobody likes him. I don't know why that part factors in so heavily, but
more that he's obsessed with grief.
Yes.
If he didn't commit the murder, which I don't think would make sense.
Now these, go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, anyone who's so just dedicated to trying to find the answer, I mean, he's going to be obsessed by it, and he's going to be so desperate to solve this question that, maybe he's not being diligent in every sense of the word.
Yeah. Now, these criticisms come primarily from Pamela Werner, MurderPeking.com, which from what I can tell used to be a website run by the descendants of some of the people French was implicating.
Like the dentist.
Prentice the dentist. But it's hard to tell more than that.
Prentice's descendants.
Prentice's apprentice dentist descendants. It's hard to tell more than that because that site it now exclusively advertises the later book, A Death in Peking, by former cop Graham Shepard.
Interesting. Well, either he bought the domain or he bought them.
Or they bought him, right? I mean, it
Right.
could be because his book, A Death in Peking...
if Prentice didn't do it.
Well, no, it's A Death in Peking, Who Really Killed Pamela Werner is the title of the book. It reads like this guy Shepard read Midnight in Peking and had some of the same thoughts that I have about it, but much angrier. And he spends his entire, every paragraph is specifically directed as a takedown of Midnight in Peking. So these two books are in a fight together.
Interesting.
Now, Shepard's book has also been published as Life and Death in Old Peking. I think it was initially maybe from a Chinese publisher and then a smaller Western publisher. He says he read Midnight in Peking and immediately spent 3 years researching his own book because he was sure French was leaving something on the table by depending so hard on Werner. Mm-hmm. But again, I don't know. I just want to make it clear that I don't know if this guy was hired by the descendants of the dentist, the descendants of Prentice the dentist, to clear their ancestor's name or...
Right. There's a weird overlap there that you can't explain.
Right. So I think both of these books have problems with...
trustworthiness?
A little bit. Enough so that I would recommend, if you want to know more about this case, maybe read both of these and see where you fall. Because the two books are fighting with each other. A Death in Peking offers alternate theories. Certainly, as we've mentioned before, Carrie, and this is kind of where my mind goes immediately with this case, the body mutilation calls psychosexual serial killers like Jack the Ripper to mind. Mm-hmm. And records of crimes against Chinese residents of Beijing at the time are missing. I mean, it's possible they were never kept, but we certainly don't have...
Well, again, there was a war.
Yeah.
There was, occupying forces.
It's possible they were kept and then destroyed by the Japanese, yes. Mm-hmm. So we don't know, right, if there were other crimes similar to this.
Yeah.
We know about Pamela because she was white.
Yeah, and there were different records there.
So that's interesting. Mm-hmm. And after the fact, certainly the city fell into chaos. So if this was a serial murderer, maybe they died, maybe they went somewhere else.
Well, I feel like if there were similar crimes to this and they just had happened to Chinese people, Werner would have noted that. That would have been something that he would have investigated. Like, oh, this other person was murdered and their heart was taken. Maybe I should follow this thread.
But
he seemed pretty diligent about following everything else up.
But only if he knew about it. It seems like... To be honest, it seems like part of the reason the police were so interested in investigating this case is because a European woman had been killed in their
I suppose.
Jurisdiction. And I think Russian and Chinese people were being found dead on the streets literally every day in Beijing at this time, and there's no way Werner would have known the cause of death of all of them. Mm-hmm. Or police, any individual cop, Now, according to Death in Peking, several British academics and diplomats living in Beijing at the time believed the Japanese army had killed Pamela. Then this is a much bigger jump to me than believing that, say, the Kuomintang had done it because she looked like snow. Mm-hmm. Because this would have been Pamela was the target of the murder in revenge against the consul, Fitzmaurice.
Oh, I was just thinking, just to instigate shit like they were doing.
Well, they were doing stuff like that. That's true. But this is another one of these false flaggy. I told you this is kind of a running theme for the Japanese army, especially in this region at the time. Mm-hmm. The Sakasi incident, the Sakasi incident, the Japanese claimed that 2 soldiers, I think Sakasi was the name of one of the guys who supposedly died, had been killed by British legation guards. Remember how everybody was allowed to have some soldiers in the country? So the Japanese claimed a few of their guys had been killed by unprovoked attack from British soldiers. The British refused to prosecute the 2 soldiers, the Japanese pointed out. But the British say they were never even shown any bodies, and that the Japanese were just trying to provoke some kind of a reaction.
I don't know. I don't think it's as crazy as... I don't think there's any direct revenge thing going on, but they're obviously doing some stuff to provoke. I could see them murdering a white person knowing that it'll be in the news as heavily as it was, and then making it a really grotesque murder to drum up fear and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem too far away from what they were already doing, trying to provoke fear.
But a revenge or political murder, you would assume, again, the bullet behind the back of the ear. But you're saying, like, if it's to create fear in the streets or whatever.
Yeah, you mutilate.
Now, with the Japanese theory, which was more popular than I would have thought in the English parts of the city at the time, and referring to the belly cuts on Pamela. One British diplomat said to another, "As you will know, there are traditions of this sort of thing in Bushido." I know why you're laughing.
Asian honor?
Yeah. For anyone who, boy, oh boy.
How do we even describe this?
We'll cover the Rebecca Zahow killing probably on this podcast at some point 'cause it's a fascinating story.
Oh yeah, we have a book on it, so we're definitely going to cover it.
But there is an Unsolved Mysteries or just a miniseries. What was it?
It was a miniseries.
Death at the Mansion about that. And at one point, so this woman died, and she was from an island?
Well, she was,
Filipino.
yeah, of some kind. I think she was Filipino.
I think she was Filipino. And so she had this rich boyfriend, and when she dies, the whole point is it suicide or not? But when she died, she had just done something the day before that people thought she would be guilty or ashamed of. Despondent. And so when this her boyfriend, when the brother walks into the hospital room, he says, "What do you mean? Why would she have done this?" And the boyfriend just goes like, "Asian honor," with a belly cut motion.
Yeah, and so that's always stuck with us after watching that. Is like that's the craziest response ever
Death at
to
the
your
mansion.
girlfriend possibly killing herself.
Well, Asian honor.
Yeah, a very much a shrug and a sigh kind of thing.
So that came to my mind here with there are traditions of this sort of thing in Bushido.
Yeah.
Now Richard Dennis believed that Pamela had been killed. His most likely suspect. He didn't have obviously enough evidence to arrest the guy. Actually, Shepard points out, the author of the second book points out that we don't know they didn't try to arrest this guy, but we know they didn't arrest Han Shu-ching, Pamela's old boyfriend, the same one whose nose Werner had broken. Mm-hmm. I guess the two were still friends. He still lived in Beijing and was seen around. But shortly after this murder, according to Werner anyway, he vanished for a little while and then came back. Werner also says Shu-ching was, quote, later murdered by some Japanese in an unrelated matter. But he doesn't, again, appear to ever have been arrested for the crime. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that was what Scotland Yard liked, was if not that guy, then they got very interested when Werner was like, "I broke this young ruffian's nose!"
Right.
They were like, "Oh, you did you?" But failing that, maybe another sexually frustrated young Chinese man was kind of their working theory. And the reason I say Chinese man specifically is there weren't a lot of women in the city, but there especially were not a lot of Chinese women in the city. Mm-hmm. So like those Russian prostitutes we mentioned were especially popular with young Chinese men who didn't have a lot of women in the area. That doesn't mean that they go murder. Right.
But yeah, it's a bit of a leap.
That was part of the police theories. By the way, around 1941, Werner also definitely mentioned this theory. He was writing a letter to one of his many pestering letters to the consulate. He was like, "I no longer think it was Prentice. Now I think it was Han Shu-ching, an old school friend of mine." And he talks about how he broke the guy's nose, and it's like, we know you broke the guy's nose, Werner.
Yeah.
Shepard also brings up, again, Werner's own violent temper. Now, as you point out, there's no evidence anywhere that he ever hurt his daughter. Mm-hmm. And in fact, she seems to have kind of been the center of his world.
Right.
So I don't buy a fit of rage where Werner accidentally kills her, but both authors at least mention the possibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's something you have to investigate, but it doesn't seem like there's much there.
Yeah. Now, Graham Shepard, spoiler alert here, I guess, in Death in Peking, Graham Shepard ultimately concludes that the most likely suspect to him is Han Shu-ching acting as a, lone assailant.
Either still sexually obsessed with her and or getting revenge on her father in some way.
But I do think the nose beating incident had happened a couple of years before, so I don't...
Yeah, well, it was when she was 13 or 14, right? And now she was 19.
The 13, 14, that's me doing some math, but yes, I think it was earlier in the decade.
Yeah, so it seems like a bit of a grudge to hold if that's the thing, but if he's still, obsessed with her, if he was even at all initially.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. So that's all we have to go on with this case. And let me get your gut first, Carrie.
Oh God, I don't even know. It's suspicious that there were so many lies told. Like, why didn't the guy just say it was animal blood on his knife? Why? Like, who was lying in the case of the rickshaw driver? Was it the rickshaw driver initially, or was it the Chinese investigator? And Prentice, the dentist. Why would he lie about never having seen Pamela before? Now, I would imagine dentists don't know every single one of their patients, right? But this doesn't seem like a situation where he had an office with multiple secretaries and he's always seeing people. He seems to be more dealing with people directly, right?
I can't be sure. I have no idea about that. But it's not totally clear to me that Scotland Yard... I think several... Okay, so this is where the two books fight.
Yes.
Shepard says that several of the police interrogation interview scenes that happen in Midnight in Peking, there's just no evidence that they happened at all. I guess there's no record of the guy from Scotland Yard. There's no record of Dennis interviewing anyone in this case. Hahn conducted interviews, but there's no record Dennis did. So if Hahn was supposedly the guy who got the information from Prentice about the...
Well, why would Hahn have done the interviews if Scotland Yard was brought in to do interviews with European people, including Prentice and all these other people?
Yeah, no, you're right. And there's a lot of...
Weird.
And I have to say, if one of the books feels slapdash in its presentation, it's not Midnight in Peking. It would be...
The one that's kind of responding to it?
Yeah, the later one.
Gosh, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I do believe the guy spent 3 years doing research. I'm not saying that it feels like his research was slapdash, but I might not agree with all his conclusions either, is I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think Prentice, the dentist, is suspicious, and I also think
the
ex-boyfriend, just in general, is always going to be suspicious, especially when he has this kind of established antagonistic relationship with the father.
Graham Shepard doesn't think the nude weekends happened at all. He thinks those are a figment of Werner's imagination.
Is the only proof we have or any reference of that from Werner, or were there other records from interviews?
Well, it gets shaky, right? Because the only primary sources that I can look at from the internet are newspaper reports when you pull them up.
Yeah.
When you can pull them up. And the newspapers that I have seen don't distinguish really where they're getting the nude weekend thing from.
They say that him writing into them, or is it actually from the cops?
Right. We have it on good authority that Pinfold told investigators, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh yeah, Pinfold. I don't know. There's just so many. Now, there's so many loose threads, and many things were probably destroyed in the war that we could never get a real full conclusion about this.
My gut is the nudist parties were going on. I don't think that Pamela Werner or her death had anything to do with them.
Mm-hmm. People be freaky. I mean, it doesn't. Why not there be nudist parties? It could be just completely unrelated.
Well, but also occasional nudist parties is different too than it makes it sound like there's some kind of a bacchanalia society that's out there doing rituals. You know what I mean?
I don't know.
So I think here's the truth: the similarity of the crime itself to the Ripper murders, and the fact that we have such bad records for crime in the city before and after this immediate event, and the fact that after this, we have an easy explanation for why anyone could have died or disappeared. I just feel like it certainly could have been a sexually frustrated or either directly frustrated by his relationship with Pamela or sexually frustrated in general in an incel kind of a way. It could have been that. But I could just as easily, just 100% as easily, believe that it's a psychosexual serial murderer.
Well, it feels sexually motivated unless, like I said before, that was to throw you off, right? Because that's a possibility. And we have just as much proof for that as we do anything else. But the nature of the murder, well, not the murder, because that was blunt force trauma, but the nature of the injuries and the mutilation of the body feels very psychosexual. So it could be an ex-boyfriend, or it could be a dentist that just recently had this girl in and became obsessed with her. I don't know what I believe in more. I think there are definitely missing puzzle pieces here, very, very big ones.
I think there's other bodies, because I don't think the first time you kill someone, you pull their heart out through their ribs.
Yeah, you got a point there, unless you've been planning this in some fashion, unless this is very, very focused. But usually in cases like this wouldn't be the only time this happens.
You work up to this killing.
Unless it's so targeted. But I don't know. I just don't know.
I'll tell you 100% what I don't buy is the initial police conclusion that somebody was trying to dismember the body.
It
Starting
seems like they were taking out stuff that they knew they wanted.
Yeah, like I just love the idea of like, yeah, let's start with the liver and the heart. That'll make her a little smaller.
Yeah,
it's like, no. Well, why? You start with the arms and legs, surely.
Yeah. So yeah, I honestly, I feel like there are some really big pieces missing here, and we're never going to really know.
It's from 1937.
Unless we like miraculously discover a bunch of records in someone's basement or whatever.
Now, I believe both authors fully own in their books the fact that none of these people could be convicted for this crime now, right, on modern standards of evidence and stuff. There's no beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt here. We just have to...
Well, I can also appreciate or empathize with Prentice's descendants, that they wouldn't want to be associated with a serial killer. They don't want their ancestor to be, called like this terrible sexual murderer. Some people are fine with that, as we'll see when we cover H.H. Holmes and the Black Dahlia. But most people don't want to be related to murderers.
And probably Jack the Ripper. I mean, if they knew.
They could be the same person. We'll talk about it.
Soon.
Oh. It's true crime time. This week we have a rare update to one of our earliest cases. Way back in episode 9, we covered the mysterious death of the Somerton man, a John Doe who died in Australia 73 years ago. We recently reported that they were exhuming the body for testing, and it looks like there have been some fruitful results.
I know, the results are back. I can't do Australian.
Via the New York Times, this update does not come from the South Australian police, but rather researchers, including a Australian professor of biomedical engineering who has studied the case for over a decade, and an American genetic genealogist whose company works on cold cases in many countries. The pair, Dr. Derek Abbott and Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, were able to extract DNA from a hair that had been pulled from the dead man's face via a plaster cast death mask made when his body was first discovered in 1948.
That's awesome. Do they do death masks anymore, or is it just a photograph now?
I don't know. I want a death mask for sure.
I'll do one, but you're gonna outlive me, so it's not gonna matter. I'll tell you what. When I do die, I'll just leave out a vat of wax. So eventually,
Okay.
Dr. Derek Abbott, we mentioned in our Somerton Man episode, right?
We did. Using GED Match, a genealogical research site that was also used in the Golden State Killer case, they found a distant cousin on the Somerton man's paternal side. They then built out a family tree of more than 4,000 people.
Wow.
They soon realized that a man in the tree named Carl Webb, who went by Charles, had no date or documentation of death. They also found that Webb was born in 1905 in Victoria, the state that the police in the 40s believed the Somerton man was from, and he had also worked as an electrical engineer and instrument maker. His sister was also married to a man named Thomas Keene, and the name T. Keene, or just Keene, had been found written on a laundry bag and some clothing that was in the Somerton man's possession.
Oh my God. So he stole his brother-in-law's
Or he was just wearing
bag.
it. So working further with the DNA, they then traced the man through his mother's line to find a living relative and triangulate a match. Said Dr. Fitzpatrick, "In all this soup and ocean of DNA cousins, we were able to connect one of them to Carl's father and one of them to Carl's mother. You really kind of narrow it down so much it could be any one of Carl's siblings, but Carl is the one with no documented death."
Wow.
So again, this hasn't been verified by police, and it still gives no cause of death for the Somerton man, nor what led to that death, but perhaps now we can finally begin to call him Carl Webb, or Charles, as he seemed to prefer.
Charlie. I'm going with Charlie.
And I'm going to finish the story off with a really cute bit from the New York Times article that I think we've mentioned previously, but it's just so adorable. Quote, "Their conclusion does knock out one theory that had entangled Dr. Abbott's personal life with the Somerton mystery. In 2009, he tried to find a woman whom the police interviewed in their original investigation because of a phone number in the poetry book. She had died, however, as had her son, a professional ballet dancer whose distinctive teeth and ears resembled the Somerton man's. Dr. Abbott managed to interview that man's daughter, Rachel Egan, a meeting that led to courtship and then marriage in 2010.
Yeah, we talked about this family that apparently has nothing to do with the case extensively in our Tamam Should. Is that episode called Somerton Man or Tamam Should for people who... Oh,
Tamam Should, Mystery of the Somerton Man, something like that.
Go looking.
Yeah. Now, if the researchers are correct and was indeed Charles Webb whose body was found on the beach all those decades ago, those physical features were just a bizarre coincidence, and Miss Egan is not the granddaughter of the Somerton man. "I'm waiting for Derek to file divorce papers," she said. Her husband offered a quick clarification. "She's kidding," he said.
Oh, they sound like us.
Yeah, they're very cute.
You wouldn't be kidding.
Well, I would be concerned that you weren't interested anymore in my lineage. But no, it's very, very adorable. And, you know, if the police do say this is definitely the guy, we'll let you guys know. But this is very interesting for sure.
Well, it sounds like it definitely is.
Sounds pretty reasonable. Yeah.
Well, we only thought it was Egan's grandfather because of some more circumstantial genetic evidence.
I don't know. I still think the Somerton man was a spy that knocked up this lady.
Oh, we had a beautiful story. We can now we can do the movie.
Yeah, it's true. That's it for this episode of Ain't It Scary with Sean and Carrie. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Ain't It Scary, and check out our website at ain'titscary.com. You can support the show by supporting our sponsors and becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/ain'titscary. And please subscribe to the show and throw us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and also now on Spotify. We'll be forever grateful.
We certainly will, and as always, we offer special thanks to our beloved top-tier patrons: Nate Curtis, Sean O'Donnell, Jared Chamberlain, Maria Ferrante, Robin McCabe, Comfy Mike, Alex Nakutis, Ryan Regan, Christy Atchison, and Ira. We love you guys.
See you next Thursday.
Show created by Sean and Carrie McCabe, music by Kyle Ryan, and you can find Kyle at his YouTube channel, Music is a Verb, seldom updated, but still good.
Ain't It Scary has been brought to you by Killer Podcasts and is a production of Longboy Media.
Something is creeping in, don't follow it down.
24 hours ago, I found out the person that I've been dating for the last 6 months is a con man.
That is my sister Emma. Andrew Tonks's lies had been so convincing, she'd invested $300,000 with him. However, the tables were about to turn on Andrew. What he didn't know was that Emma had discovered his real identity. But to get any chance of justice, Emma had to act like it was business as usual. Coming up in this series.
And that's when murder, all this stuff goes through my mind. I'm really, really scared.
I'm assuming Sarah has watched too much Netflix and figures I've been defrauding you. Couldn't be further from the truth.
That's what this was, a real-life story that seems so unbelievable, but it was actually true.
A true story that all starts with one simple swipe to the right. I'm Sarah Ferris.
And I'm Emma Ferris, and this is my story, Conning the Con.